Hello friends, I hope you've been well. Before we get painting, I just wanted to mention my shop update. I've got new prints, sticker sheets, keychains, and more. Plus, all of the Zodiac Portrait series are available as foiled limited edition prints, as well as the leftover Patreon rewards are on there. And lastly, I'm running a holiday sale for 20% off selected items. Shop is going to be linked in the description. No pressure, of course, but it's there if you want to. Support your girl, you know. But anyways, now on to the illustration process. As you might have guessed, we are working on Bubbles from the Powerpuff Girls. This year for Patreon, the theme was magic, and while I definitely took some liberties throughout the year with that theme, when I had the last 3 months left, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do all 3 Powerpuff Girls? And so that's what we're going to do. I did Buttercup last month, who is my personal favorite right now. And the process for her is available as an exclusive video on Patreon. The voiceover was basically a kind of podcast, just catching up everyone on what I've been up to. I had a really crazy October and what is going to be happening for me moving forward and what's going to be on my to-do list for next year and whatnot. But yeah, the process for this, I decided to go with hot press paper because I intended for this to be a mixed media illustration with acrylic gouache as well as colored pencils, but I actually didn't really end up using colored pencils much in the Buttercup illustration. And then when I started working on Bubbles, I just was like, yeah, I really don't think it feels necessary. But I do think that going with hot press paper ended up being the right call anyways, despite not using colored pencils, because you'll see later that I use acrylic paint markers fares better on hot press paper. As for how I decided to come up with the look of these illustrations, it was a combination of being inspired by older Powerpuff Girls fan art that I did back in 2019, I think it was. I did, a cutesy modern take on them, and then I'm revisiting them in my style now, but also very much inspired by Japanese decora aesthetics, which is something that is not new here. I love that look with the decorative stickers, band-aids, clips. I just went even more maximalist with it here. And of course, I had to include the iconic Powerpuff Girls heart motif for the background that you see at the ending theme for the original series. I like to start with the skin most of the time, so you can see here that I am starting out with a very strong pink for the blushy parts of the face, and I do use a bottle of water that I just use to drop into the paint so that we can dilute it, since I find that straight out of the tube acrylic gouache is often a little bit too thick, especially in these early stages of the painting. But you can see I basically just layer, or maybe layering is not quite the right word at this stage, but we're mixing our 2 colors directly on the painting and working with them while they're all still wet so that they can blend seamlessly together. That's why I like to have all of the colors that I need on the palette ready to go so that I can just very quickly grab them and work on the painting while all the paint is still wet. And that's kind of how I get a lot of the kind of gradients. And basically her skin tone is comprised of 3 colors here, which are all straight out of the tube. Obviously, I will start to mix them a little bit with each other to get better gradients, but for the most part, it's just like a really strong pink, like bubblegum pink, very, very pale peachy pink, and then a more yellow toned peach with like more white in the base. Very, very simple. But yeah, the thing that I would say to note about these early stages with the acrylic gouache painting is that you want the layers to be thin. So I'm using more water diluted into the paint so that we're keeping it very smooth, and that way we can still see the sketch lines underneath as well. And you'll see that I basically just paint directly over all of the accessories and that to me makes things just easier to paint in like these larger blocks of color. And since acrylic gouache is opaque anyways, I don't have to worry about necessarily painting around every single element. If this was watercolors, however, I would unfortunately have to paint around every single thing. So that's sometimes how I determine which medium is better suited for the thing that I'm trying to work on, or what sorts of mixed media elements I bring into an illustration, of what is going to be the most efficient process-wise, but also like what final look am I going for. And ultimately with these Powerpuff Girls illustrations, I wanted them to be like fairly graphic and fun and punchy and very like bold colors. And I wasn't really focused on a ton of rendering and didn't necessarily need like a ton of gradients either. So that's why I thought acrylic gouache was the better choice as opposed to using watercolors. And while we're on the topic of efficiency, the irony is that you would have seen that I do a digital version, sketch, color, everything before I do my traditional version. And especially when it comes to my acrylic gouache illustrations, they sometimes get mistaken for digital already. And I recently had someone ask, what is it that makes you decide to do a traditional version in the first place if the digital version is already, halfway there basically, and would be so much faster to just complete it digitally. And while that is definitely true, and for sure is the case with this background here, like doing the background digitally, it's just flat colors. It's so much faster to do digitally, and it's so much more tedious to do traditionally. But there is a certain quality that comes from doing illustrations traditionally that I can never truly achieve with digital. There's just all these little textures and imperfections that, yes, you can mimic. When you work digitally, there's a lot of different textures and brushes that you can use. It's just not quite the same, in my opinion. And there is something so magical about just working with your hands physically and having a finished physical painting to have in your hands. And yeah, you can see here that I ended up using the wrong shade in certain parts of the heart shape here. So I had to completely paint over it again, which it's very time consuming. And that's something that would have taken me seconds to fix digitally. But there's just a labor of love that I can never totally step away from traditional. And this also is a testament to how nice and opaque the acrylic gouache is. And there's just something so satisfying about trying to get those crisp lines and mixing the exact right shade of blue. And I actually really enjoy painting flat areas. It's just very satisfying to me. And also, this is a really good example of why I like having these filbert or flat brushes in my collection of paintbrushes, because it helps you achieve that much smoother, flatter, brush textureless area. Anyways, back to the skin again here. We are basically just repeating what I did for that first layer, but just reinforcing the opacity and just trying to smooth out the gradients as much as possible. And when it comes to trying to blend the paint and get that perfect gradient, this is the exact reason why acrylic gouache has been solidified as my favorite medium, because I can use a lot of water and, achieve those like glazes without having the layer underneath get disturbed. Obviously, there is like a bit of a limit. There is such thing as overworking it or using too much water and like kind of ruining the surface. But that's obviously something that you just figure out over time. But for the most part, it's quite durable. And whenever I switch over to regular gouache or watercolors, I have to be like reminding myself that I have to be a little bit more careful about it. So yeah, sometimes, there's certain things about the type of process that you like that determines what medium is most suited for the type of work that you make. But despite that, for whatever reason, I still really, really love using multiple different mediums, but I do think that acrylic gouache is the one that feels the most comfortable, I guess, for me nowadays. And it's the one that I think is the most forgiving. Whereas I think regular gouache and watercolors, there's just not as flexible in that way because of the fact that you can still continue to reactivate the layers underneath, even though it's been dry. And besides the actual process of painting this, something that dawned on me when I was working on the color palette for this piece, it reminded me so much of Sabrina Carpenter, the blonde, blue-eyed with the baby blue. It's just such a distinctive color palette that obviously isn't new. It's obviously very reminiscent of Baby Spice from Spice Girls, and I think a common color palette here, but it did just give me Sabrina Carpenter vibes because I had her on my mind since I was going to her concert, like the week that I was working on this. And so that was just like a fun little coincidence or thing that was on my mind. And the concert was so much fun. I think that her branding is so smart and so fun. I just love the whole aesthetic that she's got going on right now. And so whenever I do actually paint yellow blonde hair, I want to strike a balance of getting the tones right. Something that feels, blonde, but not super, super yellow. So I am actually really glad that I used that same pink that we were using in the skin tone for some of the shading in her hair. I think it just helped give it a warmth, but also balance out, like without having it to be too yellow. And then also it helps tie in the color palette to the skin tone as well. And then you can see I'm using other shades of kind of muted yellows and ochres to glaze over the pink just so it feels a little bit more blended. And then I'm using a very, very pale yellow here just to not go like super prominent with the highlights, but just to give the hair a little bit of dimension. But like I mentioned earlier, my kind of goal with this illustration was that I didn't necessarily want it to be super rendered, but I think giving each element like a tiny bit of shading just gives it a little bit more interest. And then I did go ahead and use a very, very light purple for some shading on the lighter elements there. You can see I did it on the inside of her hand, and then I'm kind of carrying that shade of kind of periwinkle into the elements on the illustration that's meant to be white, because I don't want anything to be like a pure white. I think it is more interesting to have your quote unquote white elements to have a little bit of a tone and hue to them. So in this case, I went with like, a periwinkle kind of hue with the like pom-poms in her hair, the white stripes of the arm warmers, and then like the whites of her eyes as well. When I was working on the actual sketching phase of my Powerpuff Girls illustrations, I actually didn't look at my old versions. I guess I didn't want them to be like directly the same, but it was funny when I actually did pull them up and I realized that I used the little like fuzzy pom-poms in Bubbles' hair for both versions. And it's interesting how, to me, there's elements about it that I think hold up in terms of like style and fashion that I think still is something that I would see and do today. But then there's certain elements that sort of date it for my personal taste. I think the eyebrows is the main one. The eyebrow trend at that time was definitely a lot thicker and bolder, and now I lean towards a little bit of a thinner eyebrow, not like, pencil thin, but just a little bit thinner. Obviously, I still love a strong brow when I think it's makes sense, but it's interesting just to see the different trend cycles through my artwork. And another thing that I've kind of been playing around with style-wise is the irises. I keep kind of going back and forth about whether or not I want the irises to have like a clean line art around them, or if I prefer to have a very kind of soft gradient effect of the irises sort of blurring into the whites of the eyes. In the case of this particular illustration, I did decide to go without the harsh kind of outline around the iris, but I kind of go back and forth. I guess it just depends on the mood and vibe I'm going for with the illustration. But now we are moving on to the paint marker portion, where I use them for kind of essentially all of the accessories and stickers on her, and this made things so much faster and efficient. When I worked on Buttercup, I think initially was using my paintbrush and acrylic wash, and it's definitely something that can be achieved if you don't have paint markers, but for the precision and getting those like really clean lines and those graphic shapes and the opacity, it's so much faster and nicer to use acrylic paint markers. And I used a variety of brands. I have the Posca, I have the Molotow, and I have the Art X. The Art X ones are especially nice because they are brush tip, so I can have a lot more control on getting into those really sharp corners and just like really detailed areas. And the flow of paint on them is quite consistent, which I really appreciate, and you don't have to like pump the nib or anything like that. They are really, really nice. And I have been sent like such a large set, so there's so many colors to choose from as well. So yeah, and they're pretty affordable, I think, when you break down the price like per marker when you buy like a big set. I had a lot of fun deciding on which characters or like motifs to use for her accessories, and a lot of people seem pretty smitten by the SpongeBob on her finger, like the SpongeBob ring. I guess just because it's like an unexpected character, I suppose, and not something that I've ever included, I think, in my illustrations before. But I don't know, it just felt kind of fitting, and I think that the color palette, of course, like really suited her. And I guess when it comes to references for Powerpuff Girls, SpongeBob would have been, you know, more of the same era, whereas Hachiwara and Usahana are kind of, they feel newer, even though Usahana, I think, has probably been around for quite a long time. But in terms of, you know, like Sanrio's popularity has reached like an all-time high lately, I would say. But yeah, Powerpuff Girls, SpongeBob, to me, they read much more nostalgic. And in kind of, you know, the nostalgia train, and I was working on these, I did actually watch a few episodes of Powerpuff Girls just on YouTube. And to me, I think it still really, really holds up. I thought that the writing was really fun and smart, and it actually had, you know, some really interesting commentary that I really appreciated out of a show that was geared towards kids. And to me, just reminds me of how I really was raised by the TV shows that I watched when I was younger, and I really don't think that they're not all created equal these days. So anyways, it got me thinking about how Bubbles at the time when I was younger, she was my favorite, whereas as I got a little older, Buttercup ended up being my favorite. And it's funny how, you know, I was comparing Bubbles to Baby Spice from Spice Girls, and similar things. Baby Spice was my favorite initially when I was really, really young. And then as I got older, it kind of like shifted to, I would say, either Ginger or Scary Spice. And then even with the Backstreet Boys, like Nick Carter was my initial favorite. We're seeing, you know, a trend here when I was younger. And then switched over to Brian as I got older. However, when it comes to NSYNC, I was always and will be a JC Chasez girl. He was the one, okay? I will forever mourn the fact that they were always pushing for Justin Timberlake to be like the main guy. But clearly, in my opinion, JC was the better singer and the cuter one of the group. But anyway, back to the actual illustration here. So I had posted a little snippet of doing that dark blue outline on all the accessories on my Instagram stories, and both my friends Kim, Mako House, and Yana, Cosmic Spectrum, they both messaged me and they were like, oh my God, are you planning to, keep the rest of it really soft, or are you gonna do a hard, like, dark outline for the rest of the illustration? Because I think that it is a really cool juxtaposition to keep the rest of it really, really soft in contrast to the really clean, bold outline of all the accessories. And I was like, oh, I actually didn't even consider that, because I fully intended to do like a dark outline for the rest of the illustration, because that's the style that I had done for Buttercup. But when they had pointed it out, I was like, oh, you know what? That is actually an interesting idea, and I think it could be a really cool look. So I ended up taking their suggestion. And yeah, you can see here, initially with the eyes, I did go in first with like a kind of mid-tone blue there, which in hindsight, I actually do really like. There is just something so ethereal about it. But with a character, you do kind of want the eyes to be the focal point. So I did end up kind of going over it again with a bit of a darker outline. But for the rest of the character, I do actually end up keeping the line art quite soft, in the sense that it's lighter tones that I initially would have gone for. The line art itself is still quite clean, but much lighter values than I normally would have went for. And I do think that it was a great suggestion. I think it's a really cool look, and I definitely am open to exploring this kind of lower contrast look in the future for other illustrations. And yeah, I think that I tend to get into this mindset that every single element in an illustration has to be treated the same, but I do think that there is something more interesting about, picking and choosing how things are treated to, give that juxtaposition, to do the contrast, to put focus on different elements in the piece. And so it was like a really good reminder to be able to let go of, your initial plans. Like, it is one of those trust the process things, or be willing to adapt and change during the illustration process, depending on what will best serve the final result. And while I do use a paintbrush with acrylic gouache there for a lot of the line art, I did go ahead and use a little bit of the brush tip paint marker for certain parts of the line art as well. Again, just embracing the idea that everything doesn't have to be treated exactly the same. So you can see that I have kind of broken up the line art, where some of it is that softer tone, and then some elements that are overlapping or touching, I go over with like a little bit of a darker shade. And then we are going ahead and deepening the eyes, particularly like just kind of on the outside, to have more contrast so that the viewer really zones in on them, and give it a little bit of balance with the really dark blue line art for the accessories. And as I mentioned before, this is the Patreon artwork for the month of November. So you have just under a week left to sign up if you're interested. You have until November 30th to sign up to receive the print. Or you can also sign up for the bundle deal, where you get the print and the sticker reward. The sticker, I have Bubbles here in this cute little lamb hoodie to match Buttercup in her cat hoodie from last month. And for those of you who missed out on Buttercup and would like the whole set, I will be listing the leftover Patreon rewards for the entire 2025 year on my shop next year. Currently, you can shop the previous rewards from previous years, which is on my shop as well. And look forward to Blossom for next month, and she will be very, very red and pink forward. I'm looking forward to working on that as well. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this month's video, and thank you so much for watching and for all the support on my Patreon, for these Powerpuff Girls illustrations. They've been doing pretty well on Instagram, it seems. And anyone who decides to pick anything up from my shop, I really appreciate it. And I would love to know who is your favorite Powerpuff Girls, and if you are also someone who grew up with Spice Girls, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, I would love to know your favorites for them as well, because why not? It's just, you know, a 2000s type of convo happening today. So anyways, thank you so much, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.